This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, you're at the Republican convention. What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt this weekend. If you thought that things couldn't get worse in this campaign, somebody tried to kill the former and perhaps future president of the United States. He survived that. There was an incredible New York Times picture. I don't know if you saw, Danny, over where you are.
I did.
They literally caught, you can see the bullet whizzing by his head. I mean, he literally caught the bullet in mid-flight. If he had been turned towards the crowd speaking instead of turned to the with his head to the right, looking at a screen that had a chart, he'd be dead right now. I mean, we literally were millimeters away from a successful assassination. It's just remarkable.
Just remarkable. No, absolutely. Look, I think that it created a moment, not a terribly lasting moment, but a moment in which people paused. They stopped saying bad things about their political enemies. They recognized that perhaps they had descended into the kind of rhetoric that leads to violence, that encourages people to think that they need to act in order to protect their nation or to protect their people from the evil that is forthcoming. That rhetoric, honestly, I know the right has been very focused on it, but that rhetoric exists across the spectrum. It's not the way to talk about leadership in our democracy, and it does lead to stuff like this. It's awful, and there are a lot of people who don't like Donald Trump. But I'm certainly glad, and I think many people are relieved that he wasn't murdered.
They are. It's got two effects, I think. I'm working on a column on this, and maybe we'll do it for What the Hell Did I Write Extra next week. But it's got two impacts. One, it's given Trump an opportunity to pivot and to unite the country, I think. There are a lot of people who are not MAGA, who may not like Donald Trump, who don't like Joe Biden, think he's too old, think he's too senile, think he's been a terrible president, but aren't sure about Trump, who now are willing to give him a second look and might look at this and think, this has just gone too far. We need to bring it down. And so if he can meet that moment in his convention speech on Thursday, it would go a long way towards both uniting the country and also helping him win the election. But the other impact it's had, I think, is that it's absolutely disarmed Joe Biden of his only argument for a second term. So Biden has double-digit disapproval on every single issue. He's the most unpopular president in the history of the country. 8 in 10 Americans think he's mentally unfit for another term. And his answer is always, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. Donald Trump wants to destroy our democratic institutions. Donald Trump would be a dictator. And he said literally these things. He can't say those anymore, at least not in that way. He gave a speech in the Oval Office the other night where he said we all need to tone down the rhetoric, all of us. Well, you can't then turn around and pivot and start saying Trump wants to be a dictator. So it's almost, in a way, disarmed him of the only argument he had left for another term. So if Trump can take the opportunity, see Biden's vulnerability and rise to the moment, he's saying that that's what he plans to do. He said he threw away his 20-page speech that was going to be just a brutal attack on Biden's record and now wants to unite the country. I want to see what that is. I want to see what he does.
Yeah, me too, Mark. And of course, before we get to the question of Trump's vice president and his unbelievably uniting choice, I want to get to the fact that the Florida case got thrown out. Because if you're Donald Trump, you got to be feeling really good. The Stormy Daniels case was garbage. And I say that as someone who, thinks it's all too likely that he did have sex with Stormy Daniels when his wife was nursing a little baby. It was still garbage. The rape case in New York similarly was garbage. A lot of the cases have been garbage, but this Florida case, although we talked about with Andy McCarthy on that terrific podcast about how it would have been better if they had prosecuted it, nonetheless was clearly a very substantive case. And the fact that it's gotten thrown out, yeah, that might be reversed on appeal, but the fact that it's been thrown out means it's a happy Republican convention for Donald Trump. He's not dead. This Florida case, the most serious case potentially against him, has been thrown out. And, he's not dead. So all good news for him. What do you think?
So if you think about the role that he's on over the last 3 weeks, so he absolutely crushes Biden in the debate, or actually does very smartly sits back and lets him implode in front of the American people. Then instead of a basement strategy, he does a golf cart strategy where he just goes and plays golf while the Democrats spend 2 weeks in a circular firing squad over whether or not he should step aside as the nominee. He gets a Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity. He gets a delay in his sentencing in that New York case, which now may get thrown out because of the Supreme Court ruling. He survives an assassination attempt, and now the most potent case against him is on life support. He's coming into this convention on a roll.
Yes, he certainly is. Things have been going his way. I'm tempted to cite that excellent biblical quote that pride goeth before a fall and a haughty spirit before destruction. But I guess for the moment, he's doing really well.
But he hasn't been showing a haughty spirit, Danny. He's been remarkably and almost surprisingly not haughty in the way he's handled all these things. I mean, just the other day, one of our Fox reporters asked him, do you support Larry Hogan? He said, yeah, I do. Larry Hogan, who's like a total never-Trumper. I mean, these are just things that Donald Trump didn't used to do. Donald Trump of 2020 would not have let 2 weeks go by with Joe Biden in the spotlight, even if he was like flopping around like a dying fish on the deck, right? Because the attention wasn't on him, and now he's willing to literally step out of the spotlight for a couple of weeks and let Biden, writhe around. He's the one who announced. We'll see how it comes out. He's announced that he's going to give a speech that's going to be uniting the country. If he does that, this is a different guy. This is a guy who seems to feel that he can win, and that victory is in his grasp, and is trying to do the things necessary to do that. I wish he had a different pick for vice president. But,
Mark, let's not ruin this. I know, of course, it's been ruined for the entire country, but let's not ruin this, because we talked to our wonderful guest before the vice presidential announcement got made. We asked him what he thought about whether this might be the pick. Let's let you hear that, and then afterwards, Mark and I will talk a little bit about the vice presidential pick. And at that point, I'll be able to unstifle myself. I wish you all could see my video right now. Unstifle myself and tell you what I think about that. So stick around for that. But first,
Danny was in a much better mood before when we were recording this podcast than she is today.
You are not freaking kidding. So for two things for our guests. The first is, please forgive us. We've made great strides with our sound thanks to the work of our producer and some better technology. And so you can usually hear us a lot better on this podcast. But
Danny decided to test our technology by doing the podcast from a moving train in Europe.
Right. And on my AirPods, no less, through a lot of tunnels. So please forgive us. I know Ben is going to do his best to fix this up, but please forgive us.
Brit and I sound great.
Yeah, Brit and Mark sound amazing. Our guest today is Brit Hume. He serves as the chief political analyst for Fox News Channel. He's a regular panelist on Fox's weekly public affairs program, Fox News Sunday, and he contributes to all of Fox's major political coverage. Before joining Fox News, and this will tell you how old I am, Hume was with ABC News for 23 years, and we used to watch him. He was my dad's favorite. We used to watch him every night on the nightly news with Peter Jennings, and Brit Hume was the best among them. He was ABC's chief White House correspondent as well. So here's our interview.
He's still my favorite.
He's a great guy.
Brit, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to do this.
I'm so thrilled to have you because you're one of my mentors here in the Fox News world and people I admire most in this whole business. So it's just a thrill for me to have you on here. Let's just start with the obvious news of the weekend with the attempted assassination on President Trump. How has this shaken up the race in your view?
I think it's provided Trump with an opportunity that he may or may not choose to take, and that is to say, after this assassination attempt, people who may have been thinking about voting for Trump and wondering in the wake of discovering just how seriously impaired the president is, whether it's safe to vote for Trump, may be giving him a new look and to see whether this man that they may have found a very worrisome figure when he was president and beyond, maybe someone they could vote for after all. So I think he has a chance here. There'll be people watching this convention, which is as riveted as we all are in this business to these political conventions. I think an awful lot of people are not and may not even be watching. I think a lot of people will be watching in this case because they want to see how he seems. They want to see what he's like. And they want to see, above all, whether maybe after all they can vote for him. And of course, if they do, I think his polls will improve, his candidacy will be stronger, and he will have taken advantage of the opportunity that he's been afforded.
First of all, thank you for being with us. It's really an honor for us. Trump said that he rewrote his convention speech in light of the assassination attempt. You have watched him for years now. The question of character has always been one that has bedeviled him in American politics. Do you think this actually might be a wake-up call for him rhetorically? That, Mark and I always say his policy is great, but what he says is always trouble. Do you think this could be a wake-up call for him?
Well, I think he's always had a tendency to overshadow the things that he does with the things that he says. And I think in this case, he's got an opportunity. Now, look, there's nothing about Donald Trump's personality that suggests unity. He's been a kind of a belligerent figure, and you saw a little of that when he was being pulled off that stage as he shook his fist in defiance. That's sort of the Trump we knew. And there's a character question involved in that for sure, which shows you one thing about him. He's the toughest son of a gun I've ever seen. But being a tough son of a gun and being a unifying figure are not necessarily the same thing. And so it'll be a stretch for him to appear a unifying figure. I think he'll take a stab at it, and it may help him if he does.
So, Brit, I think your analysis is absolutely right. And his base was already behind him. And I don't think there's a Trump supporter after Saturday's assassination attempt that wouldn't walk over broken glass to get to the polls to vote for him. So he doesn't need to feed his base anymore. What he needs to do is reach out to those independent swing voters because this is still going to be decided probably, unless it turns into a landslide, in a handful of swing states with a handful of swing voters who are going to decide this election. There's no need to throw any more red meat to his base. He needs to reach out to people who are unsure of him and want to be comfortable that he's not going to empower, some radical fringe or pursue revenge and all the rest of it. Isn't that right?
I think that's right, exactly, Mark. And I think if you think about this race, you think, well, how can he win it? Well, we've all come to agree, I guess, that the critical state, especially for Biden, is Pennsylvania. And you think about places where Republican candidates were once strong, the suburbs of Philadelphia being a conspicuous example. Trump had trouble in places like that, suburban women in particular. If you're rooting for Trump and hoping he'll do well, you're thinking, well, let's hope he can do things that would win over the kind of voters in areas like that area around Philadelphia where the Republican Party has lost ground under him, and where if they gain it back, they can win the election. And maybe if winning Pennsylvania block Biden's chances of winning it all. Let me mention something else here. If you think about it, it's hard to picture a period of time in which things have come up roses for a particular candidate more than they have in the last few weeks. First of all, There was the emergence for all to see of something that I think the public had sensed for a long time, and that is that Joe Biden is senile, and not just a little bit senile. He's really senile. And that's a big deal. And then on top of that, you have Trump surviving an assassination attempt, which is bound to produce sympathy. His defiance, and one might argue courage in the face of that, is another plus for him. And now we have Judge Cannon dismissing the classified documents case in Florida, which it could be reinstated by an appellate judge, but it certainly means that there's no chance that case will go to trial this year. if there ever was. And a great many people have thought, a lot of legal experts have thought that that case was the strongest case of the several that have been lodged against him. So, Trump enters this day on the verge of making his vice presidential announcement in a much stronger position than he has been perhaps ever.
And on top of that, the Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity and the circular firing squad that he's been so disciplined in the last week or so with the Democrats have been attacking each other and fighting over what to do about Biden. And he just sort of followed the basement strategy for a little while, which was, I guess, the golf cart strategy for in his case.
Yeah, who would have thought that he would have gained ground the way he seems to have just by staying to a great extent out of the public eye until, of course, the assassination attempt.
That's really true. It's remarkable. I mean, he's pulling a Biden on this election, but the fact that he's had the discipline to do that has been remarkable. I wanted to ask you more about Joe Biden, because I've heard two versions of analysis in the wake of the Trump assassination attempt. One is that this is going to elevate Trump, and it's really great news for him. And the other is that it's great news for Joe Biden because it's changed the subject and given him a pause from the accelerating criticism from his own team. What do you think? I mean, how do you think about this, and how do you analyze it?
I think that makes a certain kind of sense, Danny, but it doesn't really help when he has the opportunity afforded by this, when he goes on television, as he did last night, and not only substitutes the word battle for ballot, but does it twice. And that wasn't the only fumble. He fumbled, and then there was some slurring going on of the kind that we've become familiar with. So, I think, he had an opportunity of some kind, and I thought what he said, broadly speaking, was just fine. But it was another reminder of just how old and feeble he is.
I would add to that too, Brit, that it's in a way an electoral coup de grace for him because he can't campaign on his record because he's got double-digit disapproval on every issue that voters care about. The only thing he had going for him other than abortion was Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. He can't pursue that line of questioning the way he did before, because we now have the narrative, which I think is true, which is that this rhetoric is gone too far. And that, everybody needs to step back from the ledge. Even he said that. We all need to tone it down. How does he campaign then, calling Donald Trump a threat to the foundations of our democracy, a would-be dictator, in the wake of this assassination?
I think that issue is basically bunk. One thing that we have learned, and I'm old enough to have lived through a bunch of these assassinations and assassination attempts, and when you look back at them, it's striking how many there have been over the past half century and more. But I would say that one thing that they have shown is the striking durability of our democratic republic system. And there's a lot of hyperbole now about how Trump is a mortal threat to it and all that. It's mostly all bunk. And you keep hearing this saying, democracy is on the ballot. Well, no, democracy is the ballot. And it happens also to be the very way in which this man is supposedly a threat to democracy is pursuing higher office once again. So it's grossly overblown, and I think the public probably senses that, and that the people who adhere to that idea are largely partisan Democrats who don't like Trump anyway.
Okay, so we are talking about this, and by the way, I love that line. Democracy isn't on the ballot. Democracy is the ballot. That's perfect. I want a T-shirt that says that, Mark.
We'll put that on T-shirts.
It's true. It's true.
Or as Biden would say, democracy is the battle.
Well, also true.
The
I hate to say.
Good Lord.
Poor guy. Quickly delving into the vice presidential, we're obviously talking before Trump makes his big announcement, and there's a lot of rumors going around, which I think is the way that Donald Trump likes it. But do you think his choice of vice president could harm his nomination and his appeal to people? There are certainly people, I will tell you, that he could pick that where it would diminish very, very seriously my enthusiasm for voting for him. And of course, it's all about me. But just as sort of as a general matter, what do you think?
I think it's another opportunity for him. Normally, when his vice presidential picks, or at least in a great many instances, they're done for the purpose of unifying the party behind a particular candidate. But that doesn't really apply here at this convention. He's got the bulk of the Republican Party and nearly all the delegates in his camp and doesn't have to worry about that. And the first qualification must be, and this is a cliche and everybody always says they're doing it, Biden was saying that the other day about Kamala Harris. Imagine that. Is that this person is someone who could step in and be president right away if necessary. And I think a seasoned public figure with some kind of a admirable record would go a long way to reassuring people. On the other hand, if the president chose somebody who one senses was done principally because he seemed to be or she seemed to be the candidate who was most admiring of Donald Trump, which is something he loves, of course, I think that probably would hurt.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about what we were originally going to talk about before the assassination attempt, which is how that debate has affected the election. You know, we had the debate disaster, and then for weeks the Democrats have been in this circular firing squad figuring out what the heck they're going to do. Do you think that Biden survives? Do you think that he's the nominee? If Trump comes out with a strong convention here, with a head of steam, a bump in the polls, does the panic start again on Monday?
Well, it will depend, I think, to some extent on what the size of the Trump assassination and convention bounce turns out to be. Now, obviously, any poll that would come out on that Monday, Mark, would be maybe a little early. But if we see Trump building a 7, 8, 9-point lead in the polls, that is only going to further panic the Democrats. And it just might be enough to get to a certain critical mass where, the people he has attention to could go down to the White House and do the same thing that all those people did with Richard Nixon all those years ago and say, Mr. President, I'm sorry, but it's all over. You got to go. We can't win with you. You're in deep trouble. But, we'll all be watching the polls. I think the reason why we haven't seen any bigger bounce from the epic failure of Biden in that debate was that I think people, unlike a lot of media, particularly in Washington, had long since figured out that the guy was senile and around the bend. And they'd processed that into their thinking. And there wasn't that much ground to be gained in the polls because of that, although it became, absolutely undeniable and unmistakable after that, and I think nothing that Biden can do after that will ever get people to think, oh, well, he's made a remarkable recovery and he's as sharp as ever. I don't think that's possible for that to happen. So it's baked. I think it's baked in.
Yeah, no, I went back and looked. There was a November 2022 poll that had 7 in 10 Americans said he was too old. He wasn't mentally fit to serve as president. So, I mean, Americans were way ahead of official Washington on this.
Absolutely.
But official Washington knew this was happening.
I mean, so if the circular firing squad starts up again, I mean, one of the things we kept hearing, Biden kept saying, I'm in this. I'm not leaving. We're gonna win this race. And then Nancy Pelosi would come out and say, "Well, time is running out for him to make a decision."
Yeah,
it's
an unusual way to tell somebody to please reconsider, sir.
But I mean, we're talking now about the Trump's path, Trump's VP pick. Biden's VP pick is both a albatross around the Democratic Party's neck, but it also may be his lifesaver because no one wants Kamala Harris to be the nominee except for a very small faction of the party that puts them in a bind as a party because they can't. Normally, you would just have the president step aside for the vice president, but you can't really do that here. But on the other hand, they can't get past her. How is the party of identity politics going to pick the first black woman aside?
I think, you said a small faction supports her, but I think that faction is growing. And you hear it in the words of people like James Clyburn who say she'd be a strong nominee and so on. And, you're beginning to hear people kind of size her up and saying, well, she brings assets. She's young. She takes the senility issue off the table and so on. So, I think the party could rally around her and probably would have to because of what you suggest, which is that this party's in no position, given all that it's been and all that it's become, to shove a African-American woman to the side to make room for a more moderate and more widely appealing candidate. This party
or
has
a white male.
Particularly some white guy. It'll be a total strike against. And in this party now today, being white is a strike against you.
So just sticking with Biden for a second and talking about this question of critical mass. But, it's obvious that he's not just going to drag himself down. He's also going to drag down his party for the House, for the Senate, and potentially for governorships and state houses. Notwithstanding, do you still think, as most of Washington does, that this is all up to one woman, Jill Biden? May I call her Mrs. Dr. Jill Biden?
Tucker Carlson once said of her that she's a doctor the same way Dr. Pepper is a doctor.
Yes, notable and quotable.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's the political gravity that would normally attach to a weak candidate at the top of the ticket, pulling other candidates down. I'm sure will be present to some extent in this case. However, it all comes back to Donald Trump. And when you think about people voting, not a lot of people do strategic voting, but at least some do. And they may be thinking that I'll vote for Trump because Biden's completely out of it and we can't have him. But I want a Democratic House and or Senate to act as a check on him because I don't completely trust him. So I think that's a potential factor that has to be kept in mind as we kind of consider how much of a problem it'll be for down ballot candidates, particularly for Congress, with a Trump win.
So I agree with you about that. Part of the problem, I like Nate Silver's Substack, is he says we really haven't seen a lot of good statewide races that have enabled us to understand what the impact of the debate was on that. But how common, you're a vet, how common is that kind of ticket splitting to, let's say, okay, I want a Democratic House to control, so Donald Trump doesn't control the White House, the House, and the Senate?
I can't pick out a lot of examples for you. Americans have been ticket splitters for quite some time, more so than they used to be. And you hear an awful lot of people say, "I vote for the candidate, I don't vote for the party," and so on. I think there's a lot of that. And politicians in, for example, the state of Ohio, which is now pretty bright red, and there is old Sherrod Brown up there, having survived many turns at bat in a state that was trending away from his party for years. So I think there's enough of it, and it's a hope for survival for some of these candidates who would be weighed down under other circumstances by such weakness at the top of the ticket.
The last election was decided by a little over 42,000 votes in 3 states. And the assumption has been so many people didn't want this matchup again, that this would be, and there are so many what they call now the double haters out there who are being forced to choose, that this is going to be similarly close. But do you see a possibility that this could end up being a landslide?
I see the possibility, and it could be one of these instances where the race is close and the race is close until it's not at the very end. Because I don't think Biden can recover from the debate and the previous impressions that he continues to give us, that he's not playing with a full deck mentally. And, Trump could run a really smart campaign, not do a lot of dumb stuff. I look at Trump now and I think, he's shown, as I mentioned, some signs of being a political grown-up that he never used to exhibit before. And the best example of that came when our Aisha Hasni asked him about Larry Hogan. Now, here's Larry Hogan, popular Republican governor in a very blue state who's out of office now and running for Senate. He has said publicly and repeatedly that he will not vote for Donald Trump. And yet, when asked by Aisha Hasni about his race, Trump said, first, he said, "Yeah, I'd like to see him win." Well, Trump obviously understands a lesson that he was taught while president, that it matters a hell of a lot who's in charge of the houses of Congress. So he says, "I'd like to see him win." And Hasni says, Aisha said, "Well, does that mean you're endorsing him?" And he said, "Yeah, I guess it does." Now, that is a Donald Trump we did not used to know.
That's very true.
Absolutely true. No, that's a completely correct observation. We're watching the GOP convention. We're in the first day. We're talking about it here. We don't, know how it's going to play out. And it's probably you, me, and Mark and 3 other people who are going to be watching it for the duration because, most of America doesn't tune into these conventions. But one question that exists in my mind, especially as I'm thinking about who he chooses for VP, given that Trump is in his late 70s, is, does Trump own the Republican Party now? Is Trump's successor going to be just like Donald Trump, only younger? What do you think?
I don't know. I think it's a good question. Look, I think there's still some distance between Donald Trump and much of the Republican Party. Now, they're all lined up behind him because he went out and won the nomination by getting the votes in the primary season, and he won it easily. But look, if he wins, yes, I think the mark of Donald Trump will remain on the party. It will anyway, but it'll be even more indelible if he wins. If he loses, there'll be an agonizing reassessment. Some of this stuff that's associated with the new conservative party, the new conservative movement, may go by the boards. We have outcomes we have to keep an eye on in places like Ukraine and Israel, to mention just 2. We have serious questions about national defense buildup, which seems to be necessary, that he may or may not bring. His skepticism about our foreign alliances and so on are in play here. So there's a lot on the line, and a lot will depend on the results, particularly about his results in this election.
As we're recording this, the rumors are that J.D. Vance is going to be the vice presidential pick. There were some reports that some Secret Service vans showed up at his house, so that would be a sign. What do you think of that as a pick? Does that help him appeal to these swing voters you talk about? And how do you assess Vance as a potential VP?
I think that's would be an unfortunate choice. The first thing is he's a rookie senator, 39 years old, and although he's dazzlingly articulate and no doubt very smart, this is a guy that at one time was a hardcore Trump opponent who made a miraculous and almost sudden reversal of his view of it and has been sucking up to Trump arguably ever since. And I think the lack of experience, would be glaring. And on top of that, of course, is one would sense that the choice was made because he's been so effusively admiring of the former president. So I'm not sure he'd be a very strong pick. I don't think he adds much.
Amen to that. Amen to that.
The logic for him also is that he's a Rust Belt senator, so he can help win in the Rust Belt. But he won that Senate seat a couple of years ago by 6 points on a ballot where Mike DeWine won it by 25. I mean, I think I added up there was like 380,000 people who voted for DeWine but not for Vance. That's worrisome, isn't it?
Look, Mike DeWine's been kind of a force of nature in Ohio politics because, on paper, he doesn't look all that strong, and yet he wins and has for years. It's been effective. I don't have a demographic chart of them in front of me, but I think that the votes that DeWine got that didn't go for this young guy are the kind of votes that Trump needs. Not necessarily in Ohio, which he's probably got locked up, but in the states across the Midwest. So I think I'm not sure what J.D. Vance brings.
Neither am I, and that's one of the concerns that I have, apart from the fact that he also clearly doesn't represent what the majority of even Trump Republicans think on foreign policy. But he may be the pick, and then we'll have to contend with that.
I was just going to say, well, if he's the pick, it will then be even more interesting to hear what Donald Trump has to say about such matters as Ukraine and American defense buildup, which seems, in the eyes of many, to be needed, and what he says about NATO and the rest of it. Now, look, I think Trump actually has made a positive contribution by his threats to NATO members.
I agree.
That we're not going to continue to finance your defense when you won't stand up for yourselves in the midst of a war in Europe. I think Trump's threats, had an effect. And of course, the person who had the greatest effect on that was Vladimir Putin by the reckless invasion of Ukraine.
Amen. What do you make of the invitation to Nikki Haley to come speak?
That's a conciliatory gesture of the kind that, I think fits with his insistence that he's going to try to make this a unifying convention, that he had this speech all written, which was going to blast the Democrats and his critics with both barrels and maybe more. And now he's decided on a more unifying tone and an invitation to her to speak. The fact that Ron DeSantis is going to be president, he's going to speak and so on, adds to the impression that he's going to take a stab at this. We'll see how well he pulls it off.
So what's your metric for a successful convention? I'll ask that as my exit question.
It'll depend more than anything on the tone it sets and on the Trump speech. There'll be an audience for that because people, I think, will tune in just to see what he sounds like, what he looks like. The guy's been shot, how he reacts to all that. And if he strikes the right tone, it will probably enlarge the boost that he gets out of the traditional boost that nearly every candidate gets out of a convention. You remember that at one point, there was one poll in 1988. I was covering H.W. Bush at the time, came out of his convention. I got into that convention. There was a poll that said Michael Dukakis was 14 points ahead. I never believed the poll. It was an outlier. But it gives you an idea of the size of the bump you can sometimes get out of a convention. They usually don't last. But anyway.
That's awesome, Brit. I am so looking forward to joining you on set and more importantly, hanging out in the green room.
I look forward to it, Mark. Love being with you. Thank you all for having me on. I listen to your podcast. It's very good. Thanks for making me part of it at least one day.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
All the best. All the best. Thank you.
All right, Danny, let her rip.
So, Mark, I have a horrible tendency to let hope triumph over experience almost all the time. And I didn't believe those stories in the Daily Mail that there were Secret Service cars outside of J.D. Vance's house. And I didn't believe you when you said Pam's inside Ohio contacts were telling her that it was going to be J.D. Vance. Because I thought, you know what? A chastened Donald Trump is not going to pick such an awful, freaking, American leadership hating, two-faced, hypocritical disaster of a human being. But he did. He picked J.D. Vance. I am
Danny,
grossed out.
So, Danny, please, I want you to not hold back and tell us what you really think.
There it is. There it is. You know what, Mark? J.D. Vance was a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. That's how flexible he is politically. J.D. Vance was a person who told us that he thought that Donald Trump was comparable to Hitler, which is a disgraceful thing to say, untrue. But that's how flexible he is. He would do anything, got down on his knees, and told Donald Trump that he would not have done what Mike Pence did in the Capitol on January 6th when Donald Trump asked him to subvert our democracy against our Constitution. He said he wouldn't have done that. That is a bad person.
All right. So I did not
Tell us
want,
what you think, Mark.
Yeah. I do not want J.D. Vance to be the nominee. I have very serious differences with him on foreign policy, which as I've pointed out in my column, I think he's also at odds with the MAGA movement when it comes to foreign policy and all the rest of it. But most people aren't looking at this election through the prism of foreign policy, and particularly the Ukraine war, like I am. And so most people might not be worried about that as the number one concern they have about the vice presidential pick. But J.D. Vance, I think, is a mistake, putting aside your views of his character.
Vitriol.
I think objectively, he's not the ideal pick. First of all, he doesn't get Donald Trump any votes he didn't already have. Nobody who's not MAGA but is thinking about Trump is going to look and say, oh, he picked J.D. Vance. That's really interesting. Maybe I should give him a second look. Glenn Youngkin, that's a different story. Some of these other choices might have been, but Vance is not. Second of all, there was a theory of the case that J.D. Vance, he's from Ohio. He's got union roots. He marched on the picket line with union workers. This is a guy who could help maybe win in Pennsylvania, help win in Michigan. It's like, if people do a little bit of digging, when J.D. Vance ran in 2022 in Ohio, he won Rob Portman's seat by 6 points, a seat that Rob Portman had won by 20 points 6 years earlier. And you might think, oh, well, Ohio's changed. Yeah, it's gotten redder since then, number one. And two, he ran on the same ticket as Mike DeWine, who won by 25 points. So if you do the math, there were 380,000 people in the state of Ohio who voted for Mike DeWine. And by the way, he ran similarly behind every other statewide Republican on the ticket. So voted for Mike DeWine, all Republican down the line, just like Bud Nance used to tell us, but Republican down the line, no on everything. And then they got to JD, they voted for Republican governor, Republican lieutenant governor, Republican secretary of state, Republican state treasurer, Republican auditor, Republican Supreme Court justice. And they got to Senate. And I was like, no. And they didn't vote for J.D. Vance, 380,000 people. So I just don't think...
Why do you think they didn't vote for him, Mark?
I don't know, but he was not a very successful candidate. The reason he's a senator today is because, one, Donald Trump endorsed him in the primary, and then Mitch McConnell saved him with $32 million of funding from the Senate leadership PAC. So, so that we would have a chance at the Senate majority, which we ended up not getting. So I just don't think that he's a great candidate, a great choice. And it's sort of what worries me, it's a choice of somebody who already feels that he's winning or that he's won, as opposed to a choice of somebody who wanted to send a signal to swing voters that I'm reaching out to you. And I think it suggests some overconfidence on Trump's part. Now, maybe he's right. Maybe this is a guy, obviously, who Trump has a lot of personal chemistry with. The Trump family does. He's apparently Don Jr.'s best friend. So he's got strong ties in the Trump family, and he has personal chemistry with the president. And so he decided to pick somebody who was going to be loyal to him and who was going to be, his guy, and who he, and all the rest of it. And so we'll see if that's a good bet. It may be that Donald Trump not only wins this election, but wins it in a landslide. And he didn't really need the vice president to do much for him except be a good surrogate out there on the campaign trail. So we'll see if it was a smart choice or not.
Here's the thing. You look at Joe Biden and you say, Joe Biden's been a terrible president. But at the end of the day, he's a known quantity. Why can't we tolerate another 4 years of Joe Biden? It's because we recognize we're not really voting for Joe Biden, right? This was the weakness of his argument. I had one bad night, but look, I had 3.5 great years. And the answer is that's not what an election's about. An election isn't about the last 3.5 years. It's about the next 4 years, and we're not voting for Kamala Harris. And Donald Trump is 78 years old. He may not be in as bad physical shape. In fact, visibly, of course, is not in as bad physical shape as Joe Biden. But the notion of having J.D. Vance in office should have been something that brought just a little bit of glimmer of a hesitation to Donald Trump. And the fact that it didn't, the fact that what appealed to him was the sycophancy of J.D. Vance, someone who likened him to Hitler. What appealed to him, I suspect also, was that he can be that golf guy for the next few months because J.D. Vance can be his hitman, right? Mike Pence was never going to be that guy. He was never going to take over being the bad cop because that's not who Mike Pence is. But J.D. Vance can do that job. Great. If that's all he does, that's fine. My fear is that he validates every single one of the worst instincts that Donald Trump ever had. And the reality is that I worry about what the next 4 years are going to look like, whether either of these two jerks are our president.
Well, I worry about the next 4 years. I worry about, but one of the things that we're going to have is Donald Trump has a tendency to bring in people with a lot of differing views into his administration. And so he's going to have...
He had a tendency.
Well, but, Mike Pompeo is going to be is a strong supporter of Ukraine, and he's going to be in there, and he's a strong supporter of American leadership on the world stage, and he's going to be there. And there are other people like that. I'm sure Tom Cotton is going to get some sort of important position. But there's a lot of people we like who will serve in a Trump administration, will have a voice in these conversations. And the reality is, look, as of right now, I'm hearing reports that the Biden administration is pushing the Ukrainians to come to a ceasefire with the Russians, after slow rolling weapons to them for 3 years. So Ukraine, I'm not sure that there would be a better outcome in the next 4 years under a Biden administration in Ukraine than there would be in a Trump administration if some of the worst things happen.
All I can say, Mark, is I hope you're right, and I hope I'm wrong. There will be nobody more delighted if Donald Trump is elected and I am proven completely incorrect. Generally speaking.
Generally, you'll probably be partly incorrect. That's how it works.
All right. Well, folks, let us know what you think. Thanks for listening. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Donald Trump's speech on Thursday night, because I think that's going to tell us a lot about whether he's a new man or not.
You'll have to stay up late in Italy to hear it.
Oh God, you're right. I may not do that. It may not be worth it. Anyway, take care, everybody. And Mark, you take care there.
Take care.
Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.